how the How to Train Your Dragon franchise handles Norse mythology is honestly laughable, but I like How to Train Your Dragon, and I've been a sucker for mythology and folklore ever since I was a tiny child with a slightly bigger than pamphlet-sized children's book on the most well-known tales in Norse mythology. If this video seems familiar, it's because it's a redo of an old one that I wasn't happy with. I am currently sick, so I figured I'd make it now because while it is still work, I've technically done this before, so I don't think my brain will melt out of my ears about it. I do apologize if my voice sounds absolutely horrendous. There's not much I can do about that at the moment. Before we get started though, please, for the love of God, do not take this video too seriously. It's all in good fun. I don't actually expect a children's series about Vikings who fly on dragons to do some kind of deep dive into Norse mythology. It would have been nice if they weren't quite so blatant about the fact that the Norse myth in the series is nothing but Christianity with a shoddy paint job, but we'll get to that. Anyway, first things first, let's talk about the gods that the Hairy Hooligan tribe places the most importance on. Namely, Thor and Odin. But mostly Thor. Dear God, these people are obsessed with Thor. Which isn't actually that weird. Up until very recently in the series, their people have been under constant threat. And Thor is a god known for his strength and his many victories. While Odin is a war god, Thor is often associated with strength and protection. It makes sense for a people constantly beset by dragons to have a fondness for Thor. Aside from the two of them, though, hardly any other Norse gods or mythological figures get mentioned. Until Loki in Race to the Edge. Freya is name-dropped a handful of times, Frigg has an island named after her, Magni, of all people, gets a mention, Sleipnir is referenced at one point, just not by name, and that's about it. Well, technically, Hel and the Vanir are both also referenced, but only because places in the actual series have been named respectively Helheim's Gate and Vanaheim. It is almost impressive that the creators didn't cave to the most obvious route of having Odin, the All-Father, be a stand-in for the Christian god. But given that Thor is arguably the most well-known Norse god in our modern day and age, I'm not actually sure they get points for that. How the Hooligan tribe talk about the gods is also worth inspecting. Most of the times when Thor or Odin pop up, it's an obvious lazy stand-in for God in a sentence. Something like, my Odin, or for the love of Thor. But there are other places where the gods are talked about in ways that are more mythologically interesting, shall we say. Take, for example, Gift of the Night Fury, which also contains the series' first mention of my much-beloathed Snuggletog. Because Yule was too pagan, I guess? Despite the fact that it's lent a lot to what Christmas is today. To the point where, up here in good old Northern Europe, the words for Christmas and Yule are the same. It's all just Yule. But enough of that. What I actually want to talk about is the fact that Odin is referenced in Gift of the Night Fury as a Santa Claus-like figure. Someone who's going to be leaving treats or gifts or something for the children of Berk. This actually isn't as off-base as you might think. No, Odin is not Santa Claus, but he is an old bearded man known for flying across the sky at night. Odin also did have a hand in old Yule festivities if his list of names is to be believed, since on that list he is cited as Yulnir and Ylfothr, meaning Yule Being or Yule Father, respectively. Almost every other time Odin is mentioned, though, it's in an oath or as a replacement for God in a sentence. The most blatantly Christian thing ever uttered in this series has to be the one time Fishlegs freaked out about taking Odin's name in vain. He's also mentioned in Stoic's funeral scene in the second movie during Gober's prayer, but that one's pretty straightforward. Valhalla is Odin's hall, Gobber is sending Stoic off with a prayer that he find his way there. That's all pretty self-explanatory. There are a couple places where Odin is mentioned in a less benevolent context. Astrid makes an offhand remark about having an aunt who was cursed by Odin, and a lethal disease that once decimated the archipelago is referred to as the Scourge of Odin. It's only a handful of times, but it is nice to see that the gods are not treated as necessarily good just because they're gods. Which brings me to Thor. As I've already said, the Hooligan tribe is obsessed with him. He is mentioned so many times, and again, most of them are replacements for God. But just like his father, there are some more interesting tidbits here and there in the series. The first of which shows up all the way back in the early days of the first animated series when Stoic got his first dragon, a thunder drum. Unsurprisingly, considering the name, these dragons are said to gain power from Thor directly, which is just a neat touch world-building-wise. But then there's also this scene.
They say his roar gets his power from Thor himself. He's the god of thunder, you know.
Which I find that so fucking funny. Yes, I know it's for the kids in the audience who might not know, but to put it in perspective, imagine this. A Christian father in any piece of media turns to his fully teenaged son and says, with a straight face, something along the lines of, Jesus, he's the son of God, you know? Like Hiccup wouldn't already know this. Especially considering just how dedicated to Thor his entire tribe seems to be. On that note, there was that one time that the whole island briefly worried that Thor disapproved of the dragons because lightning kept striking the metal dragon perches they'd built. Of course, they eventually figured out that it was the metal, not the dragons, that was the problem. There's not much else there, I'm just mentioning it because I liked the episode for how it demonstrated the nature of gods as explanations for natural phenomena. Other than that, though, Thor seems to serve almost as a kind of patron deity to the Hooligan tribe. It's him they swear to the most and bring up almost every time they feel the need to reference a higher power. But, as we are on the topic of Thor, let's talk about the one time one of his sons was mentioned. Magni. He is Thor's son by the Jotun Jarnsaxa, and often referenced together with his brother Muthi. Though, I should note, Muthi is not specifically referenced as Jarnsaxa's son. So, while we don't know, they could be like half-brothers, not that it matters that much. Magni himself plays a role in a myth where he, at 3 whole nights of age, saved his father by being the only one who could lift the fallen giant Hrungnir's foot off of Thor's neck. As thanks, Thor gave him Goldmane, Hrungnir's horse. At which point Odin immediately started complaining about how Thor should have given the horse to him instead of the son of a Jotun, because Odin is a petty bastard. According to the Poetic Edda, Magni is slated to be one of the few gods who will survive Ragnarök, which might come as a shock to you if you're familiar with certain popular game franchises, along with his brother, and the two of them will inherit Mjolnir together. In the context of How to Train Your Dragon, though, he's only mentioned once, in a riddle.
Call on Magni, you'll go astray. Freya, though, will show the way.
The solution to this riddle is to melt the ice rather than try to smash through it, with Magni standing as a reference point for brute force. The show specifically calls him the God of Strength, which isn't completely without basis. For the context of a riddle like this, he definitely fits. Though I would be remiss if I didn't mention Thrud, Thor's Valkyrie daughter, whose name quite literally means strength, would also have fit quite well. Freya's role in this riddle, on the other hand, that one is a lot shakier. Freya is the goddess of a lot of things, among them love, fertility, Sather magic, and war. But fire? The only even slightly relevant story I can find is a folktale from Sweden about Freya creating sheet lightning to test the rye, which is a stretch to say the least, especially when Loki, the literal personification of fire, already exists. Freya does show up a handful of other times, though, the most notable being her role in setting the Wing Maidens to their task of caring for the Razor Whips. This is very fitting considering Freya's close ties with the Valkyries, sometimes even appearing as a Valkyrie herself. There is one other time she's mentioned, though, and for this, I'm gonna have to briefly pull Odin back into the conversation. This being the extremely weird wedding ceremony presented to us in Race to the Edge, wherein the groom is referred to as a son of Odin, and the bride is referred to as a daughter of Freya. Which is, oh boy. If they wanted Adam and Eve stand-ins, Usk and Embla are right there. Also, neither of these gods have anything to do with marriage. Possibly, maybe. There's some debate over whether or not Frigg and Freya were actually the same goddess once upon a time, that then developed, but as it now stands, Frigg is the goddess of marriage, and she remains notably unmentioned in this wedding ceremony. More egregiously, however, this episode tries to posit that a Viking union, whatever that is forever. You know, till death do us part. Except for the fact that the Old Norse are actually kind of famous for being one of the few ancient cultures in which divorce was legal and had precedent. Sure, certain conditions had to be met, but divorce was very much a thing in the so-called Viking Age. The central conceit of this plot point would crumble to dust in the slightest breeze. And last but not least, I have to talk about Loki. Oh, Loki, Loki, Loki. What did they do to you? The first time we hear about everyone's favorite trickster, it's right at the beginning of Race to the Edge, where we're informed that the twins have dedicated themselves to Loki, the god of pranks. Right. Was mischief too big a word? Also, fun fact, we don't actually know what Loki was the god of specifically. I know it's common to cite him as the god of mischief, but he's not so much that as he is a general troublemaker. Less divine domain, more personality trait, right? If you're interested in a deeper dive into Loki and his very confusing mythological roots, I highly recommend the video that OSP's Red did on him. And that one paper she name-dropped was a fascinating read, gotta say. Loki the Vet and the Ash Lad, a study combining old Scandinavian and late material, if you're curious. There's also the matter of Loki Day, supposedly falling on Loki's birthday, which is essentially April Fool's. That sure is a thing. Listen, I don't know how much more I can say other than just no. Having the twins be devoted to Loki might have been interesting if the show had done literally anything else with it than this. Especially considering how often Thor and Loki share the stage in various myths. The archetypal frenemies, if you will. But no, we have this.
Loki!
And finally, the last thing I want to touch on is the Old Norse view of the afterlife. Specifically, how we don't actually know much about it. Sure, we've got Valhalla and Hell, right? Die in battle, go to Valhalla, die any other way, go to Hell, right? Not necessarily. The binary options of Valhalla or Hell aren't actually binary. There's also Folkvanger, Freya's fields where half of the battle dead go. But you don't have to die in battle to get in there. Which neatly shatters most of the common ideas about Hell, too. So there are at least 3, the commonly cited way to separate the dead doesn't work how we think it does, and we can't be sure if there were more because the Old Norse were unfortunately not known for writing things down. Now, the only afterlife ever mentioned in How to Train Your Dragon is Valhalla. Technically, Helheim's Gate exists, but Hell as an afterlife is never mentioned. Probably because it sounds too much like, Hell. Anyway, much like with Thor and Odin, most times that Valhalla is mentioned, it's in a lazy word replacement way. They need some place to swap in for heaven or hell, so in comes Valhalla for things like, if this is Valhalla, why are you here? Or a match made in Valhalla. Or turn on us and I will send you to Valhalla myself. I get it, it's an easy way to write dialogue that feels recognizable to a modern audience. but it's also a little bit aggravating, especially the more blatant examples. The few times that Valhalla is mentioned in ways that aren't hell or heaven with a hasty paint job, it's during a funeral. Those moments I personally don't have a problem with. In fact, in one episode, the funeral in question is for a ship full of people who died of a sickness, and Valhalla is still mentioned. It's neat in a weird way because it unintentionally calls back to how little we actually know about Old Norse belief in the afterlife. I'm fully aware that it's because they're not allowed to say that these people are headed for hell, for obvious reasons, but still. In conclusion, Old Norse paganism was not Christianity. Neither is modern-day Asatru for that matter. And the Norse gods represented in How to Train Your Dragon are more often than not the Christian one telling us to pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, consider liking it and maybe subscribing. I will be back here Thursday after next. Bye!